October 24th, 1907. By noon, Lower Manhattan sounded less like a financial capital and more like a city under bombardment. Crowds were slamming against the doors of trust companies. Messengers sprinted through Wall Street carrying handwritten pleas for cash. Men in dark wool coats stood outside bank entrances, gripping withdrawal slips so tightly the paper tore in their hands. Inside the Knickerbocker Trust Company, employees were paying depositors in stacks of currency so quickly that the vault floor disappeared beneath loose paper bands and coin wrappers. Then the money ran out. Within hours, one of the largest trust companies in America collapsed. Again and again. Newspapers printed extra editions every 30 minutes. Brokers began dumping stocks at any price they could get. Smaller banks stopped answering telephones altogether. In Brooklyn, depositors lined up before sunrise carrying satchels and kitchen tins because they no longer trusted checks. One bank customer reportedly withdrew $8,000 entirely in gold coin and hired 2 policemen to escort him home. The United States government could not stop it. That is the detail most history books soften. America in 1907 had no true central bank, no permanent lender of last resort, no emergency liquidity machine capable of calming panic once trust evaporated. So the Secretary of the Treasury boarded a train and traveled to the mansion of a 70-year-old private banker, John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was already waiting inside his library on Madison Avenue. Mahogany walls, heavy curtains, electric lights glowing through cigar smoke. Around him sat the most powerful financiers and the countrymen who controlled railroads, steel, copper, insurance, and the savings of millions. Morgan understood something before anyone else did. The panic itself was no longer the danger. The danger was hesitation. That night he gathered roughly 40 bankers inside the library and locked the doors. Literally. No one would leave until they agreed to rescue the system together. But hidden beneath the mythology of heroic rescue was another reality entirely. Because while America remembers J.P. Morgan as the man who saved the financial system, far fewer people ask the more dangerous question. Why had the survival of an entire nation become dependent on the private judgment of one unelected banker in the first place? To understand why J.P. Morgan became more powerful than the United States government in 1907, you first have to understand what American banking had quietly become. On paper, the country looked rich beyond imagination. Factories were expanding. Railroads stretched across the continent. Steel production exploded. New York was transforming into the financial capital of the world. Between 1897 and 1907, the American stock market nearly doubled. But underneath that prosperity sat a fragile system built on a dangerous assumption that most people would never ask for their money back at the same time. This was the age of fractional reserve banking. The phrase sounds technical, almost harmless. In reality, it meant banks were legally allowed to promise depositors immediate access to money that no longer existed inside the vault. A depositor would place $100 into a bank. The bank would keep perhaps $10 in reserve and lend the remaining $90 into the economy. That $90 would then be deposited elsewhere and lent again, and again, and again. $1 became many claims. The system worked beautifully during confidence. It became lethal during fear, especially because America's banking structure in 1907 was uniquely unstable. Unlike Europe, the United States had no central authority capable of injecting emergency liquidity into collapsing banks. Britain had the Bank of England. France had the Banque de France. Germany had the Reichsbank. America had optimism and seasonal cash shortages. Every autumn, money physically disappeared from New York because banks shipped currency westward to finance the harvest season. Farmers needed cash for crops, rail transport, wages, and equipment purchases. That meant Wall Street entered October, operating on dangerously thin reserves almost every year. The financial system was effectively balancing on one leg before the panic even began. Then came the trusts. Trust companies were the shadow banks of their era, less regulated than traditional banks, holding lower reserves but promising higher returns. Depositors flooded into them because they appeared modern, efficient, and profitable. The Knickerbocker Trust Company was one of the largest. Its president, Charles Barney, had helped finance a reckless attempt to corner the copper market through a speculative scheme involving United Copper stock. The trade collapsed spectacularly in October 1907. Rumors spread that Knickerbocker itself was exposed. And in banking, rumors function faster than mathematics. On October 22nd, depositors began lining up outside Knickerbocker's headquarters on Fifth Avenue. By midday, police struggled to contain the crowd. Women fainted in line. Messengers shoved withdrawal notices through windows. Clerks hauled cash from vaults in wicker baskets, while depositors screamed for their savings. Within 3 hours, roughly $8 million had been withdrawn. Then the National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear checks for Knickerbocker. That single decision acted like a public execution. The next morning, Knickerbocker suspended operations. Panic spread instantly. Because depositors understood something economists often avoid saying directly, if one bank is lying about reserves, then perhaps all of them are. Patterns move faster than facts during financial collapse. Imagine waking tomorrow to news that the president of your bank had been implicated in fraud or had suddenly committed suicide, as Charles Barney eventually would, less than a month later. Would you calmly trust the institution? Or would you run for the ATM before your neighbors did? That is the brutal logic of a bank run. The first people to panic are often mocked. The last people to panic are usually destroyed. The public story of the Panic of 927 is simple. Greedy speculators failed. Depositors panicked. J.P. Morgan restored order. But the forensic reality is far more disturbing. The panic was not caused by a lack of wealth. It was caused by a lack of accessible cash. That distinction matters enormously, because in every financial crisis, people discover that wealth and liquidity are not the same thing at all. By October 1907, American banks collectively held billions in loans, securities, rail bonds, industrial shares, and real estate collateral. On paper, the system looked solvent. But depositors were not demanding paper. They wanted currency, immediately, and that is where the mathematical trap revealed itself. A fractional reserve system functions only under one condition. Withdrawals must remain staggered. The moment too many people demand settlement simultaneously, the illusion breaks, not because every institution is necessarily bankrupt, but because the system was never designed to satisfy all claims at once. Imagine a theater with 100 seats selling 500 tickets, because management assumes most people will not arrive together. That works perfectly, until there is a fire. Then the exits become the entire story. In 1907, the exits vanished. The panic spread from trust companies into the call money market, the invisible plumbing of Wall Street. Brokers borrowed overnight money to finance stock purchases. Banks provided that money daily. Once fears spread, lenders began refusing renewals. Interest rates exploded. At one point during the panic, overnight call money reportedly reached nearly 100% annualized rates. That was not lending. That was financial oxygen becoming scarce. Stocks crashed because investors suddenly needed cash more than ownership. Railroad shares collapsed. Industrial firms could not roll over short-term funding. Even healthy businesses found themselves strangled because confidence had frozen. This is the part modern audiences often misunderstand. Financial systems rarely die from losses first. They die from paralysis. A bank can survive bad loans for years. It cannot survive depositors demanding immediate redemption while its assets remain locked in long-term investments. And the panic was no longer confined to Wall Street. In New York neighborhoods, ordinary people began converting deposits into physical currency and gold coin. Shopkeepers refused checks from unfamiliar banks. Small manufacturers missed payroll because local institutions stopped lending entirely. Factories shortened work weeks within days. A machinist in Newark could suddenly lose wages because speculators in Manhattan failed to corner copper shares. That is systemic risk. The innocent are connected to the reckless through hidden plumbing they never consented to join. Meanwhile, Washington remained almost powerless. The Treasury Department did inject some emergency funds into banks, but the federal government itself was tiny by modern standards. In 1907, there was no Federal Reserve balance sheet, no coordinated lender of last resort mechanism, No deposit insurance. The financial architecture of the world's fastest-growing industrial power was effectively held together by private relationships and improvised rescue operations. And at the center of those relationships stood J.P. Morgan. Morgan understood banking psychology better than perhaps anyone alive. He knew panic behaves like contagion. You do not stop contagion with speeches. You stop it by overwhelming fear with visible force. So while politicians debated, Morgan acted like a wartime commander. Bank presidents, trust executives, railroad financiers, and industrial magnates were summoned to his Madison Avenue library under urgent instructions. They arrived exhausted, carrying balance sheets, loan books, reserve estimates, and rumors gathered from collapsing institutions across the city. Morgan sat beneath massive chandeliers reviewing the books personally, not metaphorically. Personally, witnesses described him interrogating executives deep into the night, while cigar smoke filled the room. If he believed a bank was solvent but temporarily illiquid, he organized support. If he believed it was rotten, he allowed it to die. One by one, institutions were sorted into categories: savable, sacrificial, strategic. That distinction determined who survived the panic and who disappeared forever. And then came the most extraordinary moment of all. At the height of the crisis, Morgan realized the assembled bankers were still hesitating. Each institution wanted others to contribute rescue funds first. No one wanted to risk becoming the next casualty. So Morgan locked the doors. Literally. Accounts differ on whether every door was physically bolted, but multiple witnesses confirmed the essential reality. The men inside were not permitted to leave until an agreement was reached. For hours, negotiations dragged past midnight. Finally, the bankers agreed to assemble a rescue pool exceeding $25 million to stabilize key institutions and prevent the stock exchange itself from shutting down. The newspapers would later celebrate this as an act of patriotic leadership. And in some ways, it was. But another truth sat quietly underneath the mythology. The United States had just witnessed the most important financial confession of the early 20th century. The market was not self-correcting. It required a sovereign backstop, and if the government could not provide one, private power would. By the final week of October 1907, New York was no longer operating under normal capitalism. It was operating under emergency rule. Every morning began with a new question. Which institution dies today? Outside trust companies, crowds formed before dawn. Police officers were stationed near financial districts to contain unrest. Ticker machines inside brokerage houses fell hours behind because panic selling overwhelmed the system. In some offices, men stood silently reading delayed stock prices like battlefield casualty reports. One broker later described Wall Street as a city waiting for executions. And at the center of it all sat J.P. Morgan, not in Washington, not inside the Treasury, inside a private library. Morgan's headquarters on Madison Avenue had become something closer to a wartime command bunker than a banker's mansion. Lamps burned through the night. Couriers moved constantly between banks carrying handwritten reserve figures. Clerks slept in chairs. Coffee and cigars replaced meals. Morgan himself was already elderly and visibly exhausted, but witnesses noted something remarkable. While others panicked, Morgan became calmer, because this was his environment. Crisis concentrated power into the hands of whoever still possessed liquidity, credibility, and decisiveness. Morgan possessed all three, but his rescue came with conditions. Morgan did not distribute money democratically. He distributed survival selectively. Institutions deemed salvageable received support. Others were left to collapse publicly as warnings to the rest of the market. The process resembled triage during wartime medicine, limited resources reserved for patients considered worth saving. Then came the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. Quietly, almost invisibly beneath the panic headlines, Morgan orchestrated one of the most important acquisitions of the era. His rival interests were heavily exposed to the collapsing stock of brokerage firm Moore & Schley, which had used Tennessee Coal and Iron shares as collateral. If the collateral failed completely, the brokerage house could implode and drag others down with it. Morgan proposed a solution. U.S. Steel, his empire, would acquire Tennessee Coal and Iron at depressed, panicked prices. The federal government approved the deal almost immediately under emergency conditions, and just like that, one of Morgan's largest competitors disappeared into his balance sheet during the middle of the national emergency. This is how financial crises often work beneath the patriotic narrative. Liquidity becomes power. Power becomes ownership. Ownership becomes permanence. The public remembers the rescue. The survivors remember the transfer. Imagine being a factory worker in Birmingham, Alabama, whose livelihood suddenly changed hands because frightened bankers in New York could no longer trust each other overnight. That is what systemic crises do. They convert distant financial panic into local human dependence. And Morgan understood another brutal truth that few politicians were willing to admit openly. The panic itself was beginning to destroy faith in American capitalism. Foreign investors were pulling gold from New York. Businesses could not secure credit. Banks across the country began issuing clearinghouse certificates, essentially emergency substitute money, because actual currency had become scarce. Think carefully about what that means. The wealthiest nation in the industrializing world was improvising temporary money because its financial architecture lacked a permanent stabilizer. Morgan could stop the bleeding temporarily, but even he understood the deeper problem. No modern economy could safely depend on one aging banker smoking cigars inside a locked library every time the system broke. The official mythology of 1907 says J.P. Morgan saved America. The forensic record tells a more uncomfortable story. He did save the system, but he also emerged from the panic more powerful than before it began. That distinction matters, because financial crises rarely destroy power structures completely. More often, they reorganize ownership upward away from the over-leveraged, toward whoever still possesses liquidity when panic arrives. And in 1907, almost nobody possessed more liquidity than Morgan. The Tennessee coal and iron acquisition was only the clearest example. Across the collapsing financial landscape, weakened competitors were absorbed, reorganized, or permanently subordinated to stronger banking interests. Smaller institutions lost independence. Regional influence consolidated into fewer hands. Panic accelerated concentration, exactly as it often does. This is one of the oldest patterns in financial history. Booms distribute optimism widely. Crashes redistribute ownership narrowly. The public experiences crisis as loss. Large institutions experience crisis as opportunity. And ordinary Americans understood this instinctively, even if they lacked the technical language to describe it. Imagine standing in a bread line while reading newspaper headlines celebrating the men who had just acquired entire industries during the collapse. Imagine watching your savings become inaccessible while financiers negotiated mergers inside private mansions under electric chandeliers. Resentment spread far beyond Wall Street because people began asking a dangerous question. If one private banker could save the entire economy, did democracy actually control the financial system at all? Congress asked the same thing. In 1908, lawmakers created the National Monetary Commission to investigate the causes of the panic and propose reforms. Senator Nelson Aldrich traveled through Europe studying central banking systems, particularly the Bank of England and the German Reichsbank. The conclusion frightened American elites. Modern industrial economies could no longer survive repeated panics managed through improvisation and private coercion. The scale of finance had outgrown the old system entirely, but the proposed solution carried its own irony. The Federal Reserve would ultimately be presented to the public as protection against concentrated private banking power. Yet many of the architects involved in designing the system came directly from the same financial network surrounding Morgan himself. The famous 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island held in extreme secrecy included bankers, Treasury officials, and financial insiders, quietly designing the framework for a new American central bank. The public was terrified of private control. The elite were terrified of uncontrolled collapse. The Federal Reserve became the compromise between those fears, not the elimination of financial power, its institutionalization. And this is the deeper lesson of 1907. Systems do not remove concentrated power during emergencies. They formalize it. They rename it. They build permanent structures around it so panic can be managed faster next time. The faces change. The mechanism survives, In the years after the Panic of 1907, Americans were forced to confront a reality that had previously remained hidden beneath prosperity. Their financial system was not stable. It was dependent on confidence, dependent on emergency coordination, dependent on a handful of private men deciding in real time which institutions deserved to live. That realization terrified the country. So in 1913, the Federal Reserve was born. Officially, it was designed to prevent another 1907 to create an elastic currency, stabilize reserves, and provide emergency liquidity before panic consumed the banking system again. In simpler language, America created a permanent institution whose purpose was to do systematically what J.P. Morgan had done manually inside his library: print confidence faster than fear could spread. And for more than a century, that mechanism has remained the hidden center of modern finance. 2008, 2009. Different crises, same architecture. When panic arrives, markets stop functioning normally. Liquidity vanishes, private institutions freeze, and eventually some central authority intervenes to restore confidence before cascading collapse reaches the public completely. But the forensic lesson of 1907 is not that rescues are evil. The lesson is that every rescue concentrates power somewhere. Always. The only question is where. Inside a private library. Inside a central bank. Inside institutions the public barely understands until emergency powers suddenly activate. Which brings us to the final survival protocol. When evaluating any financial system, ask three questions. Who creates liquidity during panic? Who receives rescue first? And who absorbs the losses afterward? Because history shows the sequence rarely changes. Asset prices collapse. Public fear explodes. Emergency authority expands. Ownership concentrates. Then a new era begins under a different justification. In 1907, America learned that systems built entirely on confidence eventually require a lender of last resort. The unresolved question is whether that lender ultimately serves the public, or merely prevents the collapse of the institutions closest to power.